First of all, to all the participants, my apologies. You're dealing with one of the least IT savvy people in the world here, and there's some issue on our computers too, so I'll blame it a little bit on that. So my apologies for making everybody wait. So as Haley said, I'm Chris Scholl with Cayuga County Health Department. Myself and Kendra Knapp of my coworker, we are the lead program here for Cayuga County Health Department, and so welcome to the presentation. I thought I would start just by quickly saying who I am. Like I said, I'm Chris Scholl. I've been here at the department closing in on 20 years, and I've been working on the lead program for the last 8 years. And Kendra Knapp, my co-partner here, she just received her certification to do lead risk assessor. So she's got a certificate suitable for framing, and she's going to be doing a lot of this as I sort of step away from it. But so Kendra is kind of sitting here at my side also while we go through this. So so please advance, Haley. So obviously most of you are here on this meeting because you own properties and your interest is finding out as much as you can about lead. And from the public health standpoint, lead poisoning in children is probably one of the most pernicious ailments out there. It's hard to see that a child is lead poisoned. It's not like they get a runny nose or a fever or something that you would say, wow, that child is sick with something. Oftentimes it's not even, you're not even able to determine what's going on with a kid. You look at them and think they're perfectly fine, but lead poisoning is a very pernicious thing. So as this first slide, we're talking about what we do here at the health department and why this should interest property owners. 90% of our lead cases are based on lead-based paint. There's certainly other ways that lead gets into the environment and people can be exposed to lead, but basically 90% or more comes from paint. What we're concerned about here at the health department when we visit a property is places where there's chipping, peeling, flaking paint. That's pretty obvious. The other issue though is how it gets that way, and particularly when we're talking about windows and doors. As you can imagine, windows and doors, every time we open and close them, they touch each other, and every time those things are happening, it's like what we call a friction surface, and it's basically those friction surfaces are kind of basically grinding paint chips and paint down into dust. And of course, every house has dust in it, and dust falls where it will. And it usually falls where kids are, on the floor, on table surfaces, on windowsills, and that's where kids like to be. They like to look out windows. And you could advance the next slide, please. I can't do that. You know, kids like to go to windows. They like to look out windows. They like to see what's going on outside. And of course, most windowsills and window troughs are right at child's height, just about their shoulders or head, right? And little kids want to see what's going on. You can imagine if a window there's a window with a lot of chipping, peeling paint that we know is lead. Just simply the draft of the breeze blowing in the window is enough to carry that dust right into the house and onto the floor where the kids are. We focus. Most of our lead cases are usually younger kids, like less than 10 years old. And as this was pointing out, basically less than 6-year-olds are more susceptible for lead poisoning. And the reason for that is, number one, they do a lot of hand to mouth all day, right? They're playing with their toys. They put their toys in their mouth. They put their hands in their mouth. They suck their thumb. And of course, where have their hands been all day? They've been on windowsills. They've been on floors. They've been playing with their toys on the floors. So young kids are most susceptible to lead poisoning just by nature of what they do all day. We're also concerned about pregnant women in these houses because lead is very easily passed from mother to baby. So we're very concerned about pregnancy issues, and that's another issue unto itself. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Haley. Thank you. You still hear me, right? This is a picture of that scenario I was just talking about. This is a this component, these components, both the sill and the trough, were positive for lead. There's a layer or layers of lead paint somewhere in there. Obviously, you can see all these paint chips and whatnot in the window trough. And just like I said before, where do kids go? They like to go right to where the window is so they can see outside. That picture in particular is about as bad as something can get. If you imagine a child's mouth is just inches away from basically a pile of lead sitting in that window trough. Next slide, please. These are some of the typical things we see when we do inspections. We look for places where there is peeling, chipping, flaking paint. You can see at this picture at the bottom, just below the window sill, there's big chunks of paint coming off of there. The windows themselves are very old. They're single pane windows. They've probably been on that house for 100 years. We might just take a cursory look at that and say, yeah, there's probably lead somewhere on that, in those components. This particular component was positive for lead. A lot of people will say, well, geez, we just painted. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that there may be 15 layers of paint. If this is a rental property, there may be 15 layers of paint on that by now over the years. Typically landlords will paint between occupancy. So if the lead is at layer, say 3 and 4, and there's 10 layers above that, it's when it gets chipped and peeled and flaking, and we get down to those layers of lead paint, that's when it becomes a problem. Because of course, like I said before, it ends up on the floor, and that's where the kids are. So next slide, please. Oops, don't touch that. Again, this is actually the same property, but you can see this is a very old window. The trough is loaded with paint chips. And of course, that's because every time this window is opened and closed, that just releases more of the chipping paint, the paint that wants to come off just basically to the touch. So every time this window is open and closed, that friction surface is making more and more lead chips and grinding those chips down into dust. Next slide, please. Same thing here. We look in these places where you can see where the white paint on the inside track of that window is doing what we call alligatoring. That's when the lead paint, as all the surfaces of the paint deteriorate, the lead paint tends to chip in this kind of cracking horizontal way, which we call alligatoring. Sometimes it's very obvious, sometimes not so much. But these are kind of the typical situations we see when we enter rental properties or someone's home with very old windows. This is typical. That's a red flag right there. That's most likely lead paint, and in this case, it was. Next slide, please. Like I said before, there's other places we can get lead from. So lead can accumulate in the soil. One of the questions we ask folks is, where do the kids play outside? If they play in places where there's bare soil, lead can accumulate in soil. Kids are putting their hands in their mouth while they're playing outside. So that, again, that hand-to-mouth issue is they can transport that lead from the soil right to their bodies through their hand-to-mouth. Water can sometimes be a source of it. Flint, Michigan sticks in most people's mind a few years ago, where entire city's water supply was essentially poisoned with water. Here in Auburn and the municipalities in Cuyahoga County that are on public water, they're required to sample for lead quarterly. In the city of Auburn, I don't believe any time while I've been here in almost 20 years, I do not believe that the city of Auburn has a single sample ever for lead. So most lead service lines in the city have been replaced. So water is generally not an issue for us around here as a source of lead poisoning. There's little trinkets that we sell everywhere in gumball machines to our retail checkout lines. There's all kinds of doodads, toy jewelry and things like that are coming from places around the world that don't have the strict manufacturing guidelines we have. Same thing with pottery in some cases, and in food. We find that in foods. Some foods from Latin America can have lead in them through their process. Some folks use home remedies like certain herbs. Turmeric can come from places in the world where they're in close contact to lead industry, and there's sometimes recalls on spices and herbs because they're full of lead. Certainly some people's jobs, if you work in construction or demolition, you can carry home lead on your clothing. And then of course there's other things, people's hobbies. We usually ask if people are hunters or fishermen in the house, because obviously ammunition has lead in it, and sinkers from fishing sinkers have lead in it. So there's other sources of lead, but again, about 90% of our cases are generally due to lead paint. Next slide, please. So we know through decades now of research that lead in a child, not only does it affect their overall behavior, but it has a serious cognitive effect. A long-term poisoning of a child basically robs them of IQ points. Once lead has taken their IQ points away, there's no way to regain those IQ points. And the conspiracy of lead is not only does it do that for little kids, but little kids' bodies as they're growing, they tend to absorb lead much more readily than older kids or adults, just by nature of their growing at that stage. We certainly don't want lead in anyone, but we generally, of course, are only focusing on minors, so 17-year-olds and less. But again, that 6-year-old, 0 to 6-year-old category is particularly concerning because of their lifestyle, and their bodies are taking everything in. And of course, that's when their brains are doing a lot of development. So that's when it's the worst possible time for a child to be poisoned. Obviously, any time, but it's certainly when they're 0 to 6 years old. Next slide, please. So, as this slide says, and we put it in boldface, it's irreversible. Once, especially in long-term poisoning of kids, there's no way to reverse the health effects from lead poisoning. Some folks think, gee, my kid just bounces off the wall all day and he doesn't listen to what anybody says, and we have to scold him constantly. He seems to be irritable all the time. Of course, some people rack that up to the terrible twos, or it's just what little kids do. But in fact, that's one of the very early signs that a child may be lead poisoned, because the lead is basically interfering with synapses and making kids irritable, and it makes them inattentive. And again, some of them bounce off the walls because it makes them very hyperactive. As they start to enter school, probably teachers start noticing that they're having trouble keeping up in class, not understanding maybe the basic concepts that other kids in their class are readily understanding. That can be a flag right there, how well they're doing in school. Very, very high levels of lead in a child, or in anyone, but in a child, will cause permanent brain damage. And there has been cases, not fortunately in Cuyahoga County, but in New York State, where children have been poisoned to the point where that caused their death. Next slide, please. So a lot of this slide is probably, most people could probably parse this out and understand this. If we have homes that are of the right era, in other words, while lead paint was still out there being used, which was basically anywhere from the 1920s up to about 1978, if we don't maintain those surfaces that are painted with lead, if we let them fall apart, if we let them have water damage continually, that paint is going to continue to chip and peel and flake. most of the housing in the city of Auburn, as this one slide says, about 95% of it was built prior to 78. That's probably true for every city in the Northeast United States. There is lead in almost every building in Auburn. I mean, that's really what it kind of comes down to. If repairs are not made to lead-containing components, they obviously get worse. And that's what we're trying to head off. And we've been working with the city of Auburn's code enforcement for the last few years to try to get ahead of some of these issues. Next slide, please. So this slide is just letting us know that we essentially on a yearly basis, we're following at least 20 kids a year. In the last year or so, we're up to about 25 kids that we're following. And again, there were some exceptions as far as some other ways the kids were exposed, but essentially almost every case was due to lead paint from peeling, chipping, flaking paint in their homes. We've had to have some kids that have had to be chelated, which is a medical procedure. They have to be hospitalized for that procedure. It takes a day or two for that procedure to run a course. They're essentially injecting a chemical into the kid's bloodstream to bind the lead, to try to eject it from their body. I wouldn't wish a chelation on my worst enemy. So to have a 2-year-old or 5-year-old do that is a terrible thing. It's not a pretty process. And again, this is to get ahead of any of these kind of severe cases. Next slide, please. So how do we treat this? You know, from our standpoint at the environmental health side of the health department, one of the easiest ways is, well, we find the source of the lead, again, usually paint, and we need to do something about it. So improving the condition of the housing on our side of things is what we're looking for. We're looking to make sure that those components aren't peeling, chipping, and flaking. Most of the time the components get completely replaced, which is the best option, but sometimes that's not always the option. An owner-occupied house, for example, maybe they're not able to afford to replace, 20 windows and, half a dozen doors in their house. Not everybody has the funding for that. Not everybody can afford to do it all at once. Our nurses on our nursing side of the thing here, we try to, they work with families to get their nutrition up and running. And nutrition can help, I guess, purge the lead from their bodies. But if we don't eliminate the source, you're just kind of chasing your tail. Next slide, please. So like I said before, huge impact on a child's IQ. They have trouble learning and retaining. They have memory issues. Some of the kids start to have issues with just simple communication. They have trouble, forming decent sentences. Attention deficit disorder, as well as autism spectrum issues, sometimes work hand in hand with lead poisoning. A kid may be identified with attention deficit disorder, and it turns out it's either because the child is lead poisoned, or the lead poisoning is just simply exacerbating that condition. So they seem to be linked together sometimes with kids. And of course, some of those kids need special education. They're going to the Gavra Center or early intervention programs to help them get through. And of course, that's another side effect of society, of course, is that we have to make sure these kids get the education they need, and that they need special education at that point if they're severely lead poisoned. Next slide, please. We throw this in here because if some folks remember from a few years ago, Freddie Gray was involved in an incident with some police officers, and he had been in the juvenile justice system for many years, and it turned out later that he had been severely lead poisoned throughout his whole childhood. There's people working on those kind of studies to see what the correlation between lead and crime is, but those are real statistics, and that's a situation where, if we could turn back the clock, if someone was not lead poisoned, would those things have happened? Next slide, please. So what can you do? Some of this is, if you go to the next slide, Haley, please. So we press upon, first of all, in New York State, kids at 1 year old and 2 years old are required to have a lead test. A lot of pediatricians and doctors by now are up on this. Some we're still trying to get on the program, but they have to get a prescription for a blood draw from their doctor. We can offer a limited amount of testing here at our office through our nursing program. But of course, the whole point of doing it at 1 and 2 years old is we're trying to get ahead of any poisoning issues while we can. If they get a high lead level, I can talk about that briefly, but if they get a high lead level, that's when we get involved. Next slide, please. We impress upon the occupants of these houses that the best way to prevent poisoning once we know that it's happening is thorough wet cleaning. We can't impress upon people enough to mop their floors, to use a Swiffer mop on their floors, to use wet wipes on their windowsills, to clean, make sure the troughs of windows are clean of dust and chips. That is one of the most effective ways to prevent lead poisoning, is wet cleaning of everything. You know, if someone works at a place where they may be bringing lead home, maybe leave their shoes outside, leave their clothes outside. Some of this is kind of obvious, make sure we're not letting kids put things in their mouths that have chipping and peeling paint. And we're always telling people, if you see chips on the floor, if you see paint, dust on things, clean it up. Just assume that there's lead in that dust or in those chips, and clean them whenever they happen. Life happens, you move your couch and you ding the door casing and paint chips fall on the floor. People need to realize they need to do something about that right away. Wet clean those surfaces. Next step, please. So folks should report these things to their landlords, and/or landlords should be checking up on, the condition of the paint in their rental units. Some owners have a regular program with their tenants. Hey, I stop every 6 months to check on things or whatever. If you own a home that's been identified as having some lead components in it, it's at your behest to have some sort of program, even if informal, with your tenants, that you're going to make sure that you're going to come in and check to make sure that things aren't getting dinged and scratched, and making sure that there isn't peeling and flaking paint. As long as kids are washing their hands, that helps a lot, and these other things. But if we don't deal with the chipping and flaking paint, it's just going to continue to be a problem. So as landlords, you need to be conscious that, of course, anything could happen anytime. You could paint something and, 2 days later it could get dinged up. But it's also about having a relationship with your tenants that they're going to be honest enough with you and comfortable enough to be able to call you and say, hey, look, we had this issue. We moved some furniture, we scraped some paint. What should we do? It should be addressed right away. Next slide, please. This we throw in for anybody, not just kids, but we want to make sure kids are eating right. Again, that's not so much for not so much for landlords, but these are the things that is good information for anybody. Kids need to eat healthy, and they need to be healthy. That's one of the best things we can do to help kids succeed. Next slide, please. Again, these are sort of typical things we see. And this was a rental property. This was not an owner-occupied property, but very typical. This is a high-traffic part of the apartment, okay, where perhaps furniture is being moved in and out of here, and obviously you can see that casing is very chipped and peeling and flaking, and there's chips right on the floor. Also, the way the door closes, you can see what's left of the strike plate. That door doesn't close very well. Every time it closes, it scrapes more paint off of there. It grinds more paint into dust, and of course, it ends up on the floor. Next slide, please. Exterior view, and this is in combination with water damage. Any landlords that have had a leaky roof, you know what it does. It doesn't just sort of drip into the kitchen floor, right? It's working its way behind the walls. It's where we can't see it. This was pretty obvious from the exterior. Not only is it making the paint jump off around this lead component window, but there's essentially, mold growing on the outside of the house. That's a pretty obvious red flag that there's a water leak somewhere. If we don't solve the water leak, it's going to cause the paint to continue to deteriorate and become a problem. So the first sign of that is if we start seeing paint loosely coming off of surfaces and we see some water damage, the water damage has got to be fixed first. Next slide, please. Again, kind of a typical window that we see on older properties. That could very well be, the original window of that house. Single pane glass. The sashes look like they're practically rotten. That paint, that's an exterior shot, of course, but where does that paint end up? It ends up down on the ground. Is that somewhere where a kid spends their time playing? Is the swing set nearby that? Those are warning signs for us. We would then say, hey, not only does this window need to have something happen, but in the meantime, maybe the kids need to play someplace else in the yard. But that's fairly typical. There's no storm window. So of course, the paint is just being subject to weathering constantly, and whether that window is even paintable anymore is questionable. That window is probably going to have to be replaced. Next slide, please. Another typical view of exterior window where you can see the paint is chipping and flaking, and if you can see kind of the detail at that lower sash, that alligatoring striping of the chipping, is a red flag for lead. This window looks like it had a storm window, but then the storm window is gone, and so of course that lead paint is just being weathered. Next slide, please. This is about as bad a door as it gets. The door does not close well. That green paint was the top surface of that. It was actually lead. It wasn't even an undercoat. So basically the surface of that door is lead. Every time that door is open and closed, it sets off paint chips and dust all through the place. And of course, if that's someplace where someone's walking, they're tracking it into the house, which is a bad situation, of course. If we walked into a rental property and saw that door, obviously it's chipping, peeling, flaking, we're going to analyze it for lead. In this case, it was positive. The solution there was not to try to paint that door. We insisted that owner replace that door. And of course, with older homes, as landlords are aware, these doors and sometimes the windows, they don't fit nicely in today's measurements, right? It's hard to go to Home Depot or one of the supply companies and try to find a door that fits these old measurement door casings. So then what ends up happening is you have to replace the whole casing and the threshold and the whole thing, which is usually a good thing because usually the casings and the thresholds are probably positive for lead also. So in this case, that door and the whole door unit, casing and all, was replaced with a new door. Next slide, please. This is a shot of a ceiling. And again, it was water damage. You can see different coloration there as a landlord. If you start seeing that, of course, that's a red flag that, gee, is the porch roof leaking? Let's make sure we find out, right? Again, this ceiling was lead positive. So every time the ceiling leaks, it causes more water damage, causes more chipping, peeling, and flaking. Of course, that ends up on the floor, and this was an entryway. So that was a particular concern. So number one, you got to solve the water leak before you can even address the paint. Next slide, please. And not to belabor the water damage, but again, this was a situation here where it's just this area of this home outdoors was just perennially wet. You can see it's just sopping wet leaves all the time. It gets almost no sunlight. So there's mold caused, from water damage, which is causing more paint to chip and peel. Fortunately, they didn't use this doorway as an entryway, but this was something that, a kid or anybody else could basically walk up to these lead positive clapboards with the paint falling off of them and become lead poisoned. Next slide, please. Again, another typical situation we see where this is a very old window, deteriorating. This is a window that very difficult to try to repaint this window. The solution here was to replace the window. And again, the concern is that kids are right at this height. Their mouth and face is essentially right at the height of this windowsill and this sash, which is essentially just has lead dust, rife with lead dust with lead paint chips coming off of it. Next slide, please. And again, no storm window either to prevent more deterioration. We look for other things. You know, sometimes there's lead paint in walls. It's generally not in old lath and plaster type walls, but sometimes the lead dust is just simply behind the walls because it's coming out of the window jambs. It's in between, you know, spaces between window casings. It ends up accumulating behind walls. So in this case, we have a damaged wall. Again, the wall itself is not, or the spackle, it's not lead, but it's the dust that's coming out of that deteriorated area that we'd be concerned about. And again, as demonstrated by some chips on the floor, you know, where is that stuff going to go? It's going to go on the floor where the kids are. Next slide, please. Again, this is an awful situation. This is where it's basically paint's coming right down to the original wood. You know, this is a situation where the best solution to this is to replace the window, but not just the window. You know, we need to replace the windowsill at the very least. Perhaps the casings on the side, they may be okay. As most landlords have probably found out, you know, trying to replace one piece of this is like chasing your tail, and sometimes it's more trouble than it's worth. Usually the solution is to simply just replace the window, replace the casing, replace the windowsill all at once while you have somebody there. Next slide, please. Not to belabor water damage, but another classic situation where the water, you know, the roof is leaking, and that's what's causing the paint to chip. And until you fix the water leak, you know, to try to address the painting of this is not going to make any sense. You got to get rid of the water leak. Next slide, please. I'm trying to keep up with this here. Again, another typical situation where whether it's they move a lot of furniture through this place, sometimes there's baby gates that you put between casing, you know, the casings to keep the kids in one room. Sometimes it's the pets, you know, the dogs sometimes are scraping at things. You know, this is where, again, this is right down to bare wood. That's not a good situation. The solution here, of course, is a decent wet scraping, wet sanding, and then give it a couple of coats of paint. That doesn't necessarily need to be replaced, but it does need to be addressed. Next slide, please. And this is one, this may be just tailored to what I just said. You can kind of see that this was a spot that there was a baby gate. You can see that circular spot in the middle of the casing, you know, that the baby gate gets moved and tightened and retightened, and then it just ends up damaging the window casing. I imagine there's many owners listening to this that have walked into their rental properties and seen exactly what I've talked about is wherever that baby gate is, it's basically damaging the door casings. So if you do a walkthrough of one of your units sometime, you should make note of what's happening where the baby gates are, because those can cause a lot of damage to casings. Next slide, please. So our goal is we're trying to prevent poisoning in the first place. Unfortunately, a lot of what we do in this program is reactive. You know, we don't enter someone's home until the child is poisoned, which sort of seems like, well, great, you know, at least we're doing something, but it's mostly reactive. But we're also trying to be proactive about it. How we do that, make sure kids are getting tested for lead. We try to put out a lot of educational material to the community. I think people, you know, unfortunately, because of the Flint, Michigan issue with water, even though that was water, not paint, if there's anything good that came out of that, it's that people are a little bit more aware of what lead and lead poisoning is. So that has kind of sort of helped to reinforce some of this. It wasn't the right way to do it, but it did educate a lot of people. Generally speaking, the other thing we need to do is we just need to improve the overall housing quality of Cayuga County. You know, it's not easy for people to find a good rental property. There's basically no vacancy, and so we have the housing stock that we have is what we have, so let's try to improve what we have. Next slide, please. So we've been working with the city of Auburn in particular the last 3 to 4 years. We're trying to work with code enforcement hand in hand to try to get ahead of some of these things in between occupancy. The city does a program where they inspect your rental properties from time to time. With success, the code enforcement in Auburn has worked pretty well with us on this to try to get ahead of these things. The inspection process that Auburn Code Enforcement Office does now, they now put in this idea that if there's chipping, peeling, flaking paint, we need to do something about it before someone moves in. So that's been a pretty beneficial process for here in the city. Of course, there isn't that sort of program in the other municipalities of our county. Some of the code enforcement officers in some of our rural towns probably they're probably really not clued in on this yet. But we've been doing a pretty good job in the city here with Auburn Code Enforcement. Next slide, please. We have the Healthy Neighborhoods program that's through our community health network. They're out there to try to provide some services to folks. So if you have tenants that perhaps need some support as far as like cleaning supplies and that sort of thing, the Healthy Neighborhoods program might be able to help them. So if you want to reach back out to me at any time, we can, if you have tenants that could use some assistance that way, we can point them in that direction. Next slide, please. The program is a free program. So folks would come out and do an assessment of the home, and in some cases they might ask us what our opinion is on if there is chipping or peeling, flaking paint. So that's a program that your tenants might be able to take advantage of if they need it. Next slide, please. So our main number there is 1560, and there's our website. You can certainly get, we can give you my and Kendra's email address if you have any specific questions after this, or any time after weeks from now. If you have a question about something, feel free to get in touch with us. We'll be happy to try to answer all the questions we can. And as we say to people when we're out doing inspections, no question is crazy or silly. So if you think you have some sort of a question or concern, certainly get in touch with us. We'd be glad to talk with any property owners that have questions. We'd be glad to do that anytime. So that's the lead portion. I'd be happy to answer questions, or Haley, if you'd rather have me do something else, that's up to you.
Awesome. Thank you. So I think maybe, do you want to cover a little bit of radon first, and then we'll move into just a questions segment right at the end. We'll kind of do a combined lead and radon.
Sure. Sure. So no PowerPoint to follow here, but I hope I don't bore you with my voice. But so one of the other things that we work on here at Environmental Health, the health department, is radon. We have sort of like an ongoing state grant for radon. And for people that don't know, thank you, my assistant is helping me here. So radon is a gas that's naturally occurring in bedrock and soil. It's odorless. It has no taste, right? So you can't see it. You don't know it's there if it's there. So where do we build our houses, right? In the ground. And what I mean by that is most people have basements or cellars. We dig down into the ground to build our houses. We get into the soil level where radon can be present as it decays over time, as a radioactive element that decays over time. The foundations of our houses, depending on when a house was built, don't necessarily keep that gas out of the home. The gas can travel through, radon gas can travel through the soil and through the foundation blocks of a house. It can also come from, older homes that simply have essentially dirt floors. It can essentially come up right through the floor. So, but they've also found that even in modern construction, radon gas can find its way through like the foundation drains, or if there's a floor drain in a basement, it can end up coming up through the floor drain. So even in a modern house that's fairly tight, radon gas can still get into the home. The biggest source of lung cancer in the United States is smoking. We've figured that out a long time ago. Coming in at a close second is radon gas. Radon gas is the second leading cause of lung cancer in the United States. So that's a pretty big public health issue, right? So fortunately, with radon can be solved a little bit easier than lead, because it's a little bit more 1 + 1 = 2 than lead sometimes. The first thing we would suggest to people, of course, is you need to find out what the level of radon may be in your home, if at all. Starting November 1st, we will be offering free testing kits for folks. You can pick them up either through our office, but we're also going to have different locations through the county. Typically, we usually try to have it like at the Cato or Weedsport libraries, Moravia, Aurora area, try to get them in the southern part of the county, but here in the city, both at our office and I think several other locations around the city, we offer this testing service. So of course you don't know, this is an example of, I don't know if you can see this, but this is an example of the testing kit that we offer. Again, this is free. So this is so people can find out, okay, do I even have radon in my home to begin with? So that's step one, is to have a radon test of your house. So depending on what that result is, first of all, that gets sent away. The lab that analyzes that puts that into a database for us to look at, and New York State also gets that information. So when we get a particularly high result, we pretty much immediately contact the property owner, because that's an imminent risk of lung cancer for folks that are in that house. Okay, so it starts with the free test. If you have no radon, fantastic. You generally probably will never have to test your home again, because of course we're talking about a radioactive element that breaks down over the course of millennia. So if it's generally not in the soil and bedrock of your particular property, it's likely that it's never going to be there, at least not in our lifetimes, if we're talking about thousands of years for these things to happen. So if you don't have radon, you're probably good to go unless there's an earthquake or something that changes the geology around your house, you're probably okay. So the flip side of that is what happens if you get a really high radon level. So the solution is essentially to vent the radon gas out of your home. If there's a way, let's say you have a crawl space, and you don't really have a straight out basement that you can walk into, there can be very nominal ventilation systems that can be installed in a crawl space. Sometimes they're just passive systems, sometimes they're electric. If you have a basement or cellar you can walk into, ventilation systems can be installed in the basement to basically vent it out the roof of the home or through a side vent. So they're not huge projects. There are companies that specialize just in radon mitigation, but there are other contractors that know how to do it, that do everything else. But basically it's a ventilation issue. We want to vent that radon gas out of the basement, out of the crawl space, so it doesn't end up in the living space of our home. Like I said, we would we would contact you immediately when the result is of a concerning level. Because again, it causes cancer, we know it does. So we're gonna make sure we get right on that, and we reach out to people and get them all the information they need. So radon is, it's a pernicious issue that we're kind of getting ahead of now also. So if anybody, whether it's your own home, if it's a rental property that you own, you are certainly welcome to get in touch with us after November 1st. We'd be glad to get you a sampling kit for you to do that. What we can do is, again, this slide of our website and our phone number, keep that 253-1560 number handy. We'll probably have a press release that will say, hey, okay, we've got our test kits, our radon test kits available. So, but it should be about November 1st. So please take advantage of that. It's very simple. You just have to set it up at a certain location that we'll tell you about in the home. It has to sit there for a certain amount of time. Again, we'll tell you about the ins and outs and that, but it's fairly easy. It's essentially peeling off some stickers off of the kit and setting it in an appropriate place. So if you have, again, if it's your own home or a rental property, you can certainly take advantage of that. So over time, what we found is the positivity, or at least the rate in the city of Auburn in particular, they hover sometime between like about 15 to 25% of the sampling in a fairly large, it was over a period of about 20 plus years. In about 15 to 25% of those had an action level over 4. This magic number we're looking for is 4, and it's in picocuries, which is a measurement of radiation. There are some parts of our county that are hotter than radon, in particular the town of Sempronius. And again, it's a function of how the bedrock and the geology is throughout our county. We have a diverse geography as far as bedrock and soil goes in this county. To the north, it's like sandy soil. You go to the south, there's rock. There's a confluence of everything in between. So for some reason, the towns in the southern part of our county, because of the geology, we've had a lot of sampling showing fairly high levels there in the last 25 years. The city of Auburn, again, about 20% of the sampling that's been done in the city has been 4 or greater. So we want you to take advantage of that. So listen for the press release, but November 1st should be the magic day, and you give our office a call, and we'd happy to offer the testing kits to anyone. Again, and I'm not just simply talking about your rental properties. If you want to know about your own house itself, we will do that. But it's definitely good information to know. And again, from our standpoint, it's a huge public health issue. This is a way we can prevent a lot of lung cancer by getting ahead of radon. And we could provide you with some educational materials too, if you'd like. We can email or hard mail stuff to anybody that wants some basic information that we have, and we can get you. The state has a handy website. If you want to get some information on it, it's health.ny.gov/radiation. So it's just health.ny.gov/radiation. You'll find a wealth of information about radon through New York State Health Department. And they also have a phone number in there if you want to talk to somebody. But you can also call our office if you'd like any information. So, and it's on our own website, I was just told. So, so radon is something we want to try to get ahead of as well. And so please take advantage of the testing when we start. So that'll do it for radon, Haley.
All right, excellent. Thank you. So what we're going to do now, I had one question regarding lead pop up while we were in discussion there. And the question
Okay,
was regarding what is the
thank you.
process if the property tests positive for lead, if you know, test a paint sample and it's positive for lead and the family or tenant is still living in the house, what's the process there? I'm guessing along the lines of how do you determine if the family has to exit? You know, does the family have
Sure,
to exit? Does it depend on, you know, the level of contamination?
sure. Good question. So the elevator speech on the process is, child gets a blood test, right? Okay, and they get a lead level 5 or above. We are obligated here at the environmental health portion, as well as our nurses, but our side of the health department here, we are obligated to do an inspection of where they live. So we're walking into their apartment, to their house. We're looking for peeling, chipping, flaking paint, right? Okay, so any place that we see that, windows, door casings, whatever the case may be, we have this very technical device that we use to what's called an XRF machine that we use to determine whether it's positive or negative for lead. So we see a chipped door casing, we zap it with our machine, it's positive for lead. Okay, so now what happens? What we do is we reach out to the owner. So if I'm not speaking to owner occupied folks, I'm speaking to rental property managers and landlords. So we will try to get your phone number from the tenant, because we like to call you ahead of time, because we have to send you, in some cases, we have to send this letter that's called a notice of demand. And that's a very bureaucratic sounding title for this letter that essentially says we were at the property on such and such day, we identified some lead hazards, we need you to do something about it. So now, do they have to move out? Not generally speaking, no. What the process is once we've identified that there's some lead components that are a hazard, again, that they're chipping, peeling, flaking, we'll reach out to the owner to say, okay, there's a process that you need to do. There's some paperwork that you need to submit to our office, like it's called basically a work plan. That work plan is what you're going to tell us, okay, here's what I'm going to do. We're going to so-called stabilize the components. Stabilizing is a fancy word for repainting. In some cases, the windows and doors have to be replaced. They're too far gone to be painted, or you as an owner just make the decision that, you know, why am I going to nuts around trying to paint this? Let's just go ahead and replace it. That way it's not you're not going to have to repaint it every year or continue to monitor it all the time. So you might just choose to replace it. Now, as far as the procedure goes, you'd submit a work plan to our office. If it is going to involve like window replacement, generally speaking, a contractor that does what we call abatement work, so replacing things, doors and windows, they have to have a certification from the EPA that they've been through a training course and they've gotten a certificate, because this isn't, there are many more steps the contractor has to follow to replace windows and doors. They have to set up the area. While that work is going on, no kids can be in the apartment or home while that's going on. So they got to go to grandma's house for the day or go to the mall or do something, but kids and essentially the adults too, they cannot be there while that work is going on. That work plan, once you submit that work plan to our office, we have to go over it with you. Ultimately, when we approve the plan, we're trying to get some sort of an idea of how long it's going to take for you to accomplish this. So we ask for this expected completion date. So obviously you have to get different estimates from a contractor. You have to settle on one. They're going to have to order, if they're going to replace windows and doors, they got to put in an order for windows. That all takes time. We understand that. We will be as flexible as we can with owners to make sure that as long as you're communicating with us along the way and showing a good faith effort that you're trying to do what we're asking, you know, we can give you some more time. Obviously, we can't let it go on forever, but the process is once we've identified some hazards, that kicks this whole process into gear, in which you have to submit this work plan. It has to be approved. Again, if you need a contractor, that contractor has to be a certified contractor. At the end of that process, that contractor has to do what's called clearance dust wipe samples. So after they've done their thorough wet cleaning of all the areas they were working in, an independent third-party company has to come in and collect these. They're basically like fancy dust wipes. They have a certain process they follow. They're going to do a representative sampling throughout the dwelling. They submit those to a lab. They need to come back under a certain threshold for us to consider it acceptable. Once they do, you as the owner get a letter from our office that basically is what we call a completion letter, letting you know that you did everything that we asked of you. There's a lot of minutia in between, and there's tangents in between, depending on situations, because no situation is always the same. But that's essentially the process. Is once a child has pinged this lead level, and once we walk in the door, there's essentially no going back from our standpoint. We have to follow this process through, and you know, we hope for and expect cooperation of property owners. The other side of the coin is, well, what if I don't do this that you're asking me? Well, there's an administrative process that begins. You're summoned to a Board of Health hearing, and there's threats of fines and all that. We don't want to do those things. That's uses a lot of everyone's time, ours and yours. So we try to work with property owners as best we can. You know, life gets in the way of things, so we understand sometimes things have to get delayed. That's okay, but we always want to see forward progress on it. So again, if you have really specific questions, I can answer them at another time, but essentially that's the process that we have to send everybody through. Something that I've been telling owners of properties is that 1 year ago, so it was October of 2019, the standard for our involvement changed. It became much more strict. We used to get involved when a child had a blood lead level of 15, but a year ago they changed it to 5. It's very easy for a child to get a lead level of 5 in a blood test if they're in a home, even with some minor lead hazards. So what I've been telling property owners is, you know, if you have old windows in some of your rental properties, if you have these old doors that they don't close correctly, they scrape against everything, you know, the windows are awful. If you had some idea that you were going to replace windows in your rental property, do it before I walk in the door. And the reason I'm saying that is because if we tell you to do it, you're basically looking at anywhere from, you're probably going to add 15 to 20% to the cost of your project, because you're going to have, your contractor is going to have a lot more labor into it because they have to do a certain process. There's those clearance dust wipe samples that have to happen. So basically it's going to cost you 15 or 20% more when I tell you to replace the windows than if you just go ahead and do it now. It will save you money. So one thing people will say is the health department's good at spending people's money. That's not what we're trying to do. But if you think you have windows and doors that are questionable, if they're of the right era, that they're very old, you know, consider replacing them now before the health department knocks on the door, because once we come in the door, there's no going back. So that's something for you to consider.
And doing it in a wet cleaning method.
And wet cleaning, yes. Yeah. We do care about you. We don't want you to get poisoned either, but it's got to be done the right way.
All right, excellent. And so I did have one more question pop up. It's a little bit of a different question, but some of you who were at our workshop last year, we were doing the scholarship for the training course for the lead removal. That is something that this year we unfortunately were not able to offer with a scholarship through our program and through this training. However, you can still access that through HomeSite. So if anyone is interested in lead removal training, like the training course to get certified in that, just head to the home site website and there should be more info, but unfortunately we're not able to do a scholarship similar to how we've done in previous years. But that is everything I've received in the chat box so far. We've got a couple more minutes. Just before we wrap things up here, we have a scheduled 10:10 break. But I just want to give anyone a chance, anything regarding lead, radon, if they'd like to put it in the chat. I'm not seeing anything.
I see someone's question about healthy neighborhoods, and that's a good question.
Yep, so that's actually, Chris,
Yeah.
that's actually our program. So we.
Oh, that's yours, right? Okay, right.
So I responded. I don't know if you saw it. I think it was Anna.
Oh, there it is. Okay, I'm sorry. Yep, I didn't read farther.
No,
there you
that's
go.
fine.
Yep.
So I see Anna.
Obviously, COVID changed a lot of things.
Yep, Anna. So I will be talking about that in a recent session. So I'll catch you guys up to speed with that. Then I also see this one just popped up. Is there any grant money for lead abatement in rental dwellings? Are you familiar with that at all, Chris?
Yeah, good question. There is some very limited amount of money that is offered not just to owner-occupied properties. I don't know what the status of the funding level is right now. It was through one of the block grant programs. So if there's a particular person, property owner, that would like to find out more, certainly send me an email and I can get as much information as I can. I think the feeling was they didn't want to have it just simply be for owner-occupied properties, because I think it was recognizing that, the rental stock in town is important too. So the answer is there is the possibility of some grant money for certain lead abatement projects. Again, I'm just not exactly sure what the funding level is or some of the requirements, but did that send?
I just wanted to make sure it was correct. That was your correct one, right?
Yeah, two. That's right. So certainly send me an email, and I can try to get some information for anybody that's looking for that.
And I think that might have just gone to me, so I will put Chris's email.
Oh, okay.
No, that's okay.
Yep.
That is okay.
You
spelled my name wrong too, so that's okay. But yeah, there could be some funding available out there. I'm just not sure what the status of it is right now.
Yep. So let me put your email in the chat for everyone here.
That'd be great. Thank you.
All right. All right. So before we close with this session and move to our brief break, does anyone have any last minute questions? You can use the Q&A box or feel free to use the chat if that is easier. We do have staff monitoring both. So we'll try to grab any. All right, I'm not seeing any more come in, but Chris, thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who submitted questions. Reminder that Chris's contact information is in the chat. So if anyone needs that, and you can also reach him, I'm sure, just through the Cayuga County Health Department website. So if anything pops up, feel free to reach out, and Chris will do his best to answer those questions.
Thank you. Sure will. Thank you.
Yes. All right. So we are going to, thank you. We are going to move